The word hit Elsie Carver like a bullet she never saw coming. Someone who would stay. Timothy Garrison had said it so quietly, so deliberately, his voice barely above a murmur in the warm, amber light of the parlor, that she almost convinced herself she had imagined it. But then she saw the way his two children looked at her little Clara with her wide, hopeful brown eyes, and 8-year-old Henry with his jaw set exactly the way his father's was set right now, and she understood with absolute certainty that she had not imagined anything at all. She had come to this ranch as a housekeeper. That was the arrangement. That was the contract she had signed in the dusty offices of the Garrison Creek Placement Agency 3 weeks ago, her hand trembling with a desperation she had tried very hard to disguise. She was to cook, to clean, to maintain the house, to care for the children when needed. She was not supposed to feel her heart crack open the way it was cracking open right now, standing in this warm room with the smell of pine resin and old wood and something that had started to feel, against every rule she had set for herself, like home. "Papa said you're going to stay," Clara repeated, 6 years old and completely unaware of the grenade she was holding. "He said you're not like the others. He said you're someone who would stay." Elsie looked at Timothy. Timothy looked at Elsie, and everything unspoken between them, the secrets she was keeping, the dark past she had buried beneath 3 states and a new name, the trap she had walked herself directly into by letting herself care about these children and this man, rose up between them like smoke from a fire that had been smoldering far too long beneath the floorboards. "Is that what your father said?" Elsie asked softly, her voice steadier than she felt. "Yes, ma'am," Henry answered, watching her with those perceptive eyes that saw far too much for a boy of 8. She turned to look at Timothy Garrison fully then, and she saw something in his face that she had been trying not to see for days. It was not the look of a man who had made a practical domestic arrangement. It was the look of a man who had already decided something, and was now waiting to see if she was brave enough to decide it too. The problem was that Elsie Carver was hiding something. And whatever Timothy Garrison thought she was, whoever he believed her to be, the woman who had arrived on his porch 3 weeks ago with a carpet bag and a letter of recommendation, she was afraid that the truth of her would shatter everything. She was afraid because she had started to love this family. And she was terrified because she did not know if she deserved to. 3 weeks earlier, the town of Redstone Fork, Texas, baked under a September sun that showed no mercy. The year was 1883, and the frontier had not gentled itself 1 degree since the cattle drives had turned the land into commerce, and the commerce had turned ordinary men into kings or into dust. The main street of Redstone Fork was a wide, unpaved ribbon of pale earth flanked by a general store, a livery stable, a telegraph office, a barber, 2 saloons, and a small whitewashed building that served simultaneously as the post office and the offices of one Clarence Dobb, who handled employment placements for domestic workers, ranch hands, and the occasional schoolteacher. Elsie had stepped off the stagecoach with her carpet bag, and a heart full of something she could only describe as controlled desperation. She was 28 years old, with dark auburn hair pinned beneath a practical hat, green eyes that had seen considerably more than their fair share of grief, and hands that were already roughened from a life spent working. She was not a delicate woman. She was not a woman who wilted, but she was a woman who had run very far and very fast, and who had arrived in Redstone Fork with exactly $4.30 to her name, and the absolute knowledge that she could not run any farther. She had her reasons. She would not share them immediately. She had learned over the course of the last 3 years that sharing reasons with people was a form of handing them a weapon and trusting them not to use it. She had been wrong about that trust before, and the consequences had been severe. Clarence Dobb was a thin, fussy man with spectacles and ink-stained fingers who looked at Elsie over the rims of his glasses with the particular expression of a man who processed human beings the way other people processed inventory. "Widow?" he asked. "No," Elsie said. "Married? No." Any encumbrances. He meant children, debts, or scandals, and she understood that perfectly. None, she said, which was 3/4 of a truth. Dobbs shuffled his papers. I have a position. The Garrison Ranch, about 6 miles northeast of town. Timber and cattle operation. Timothy Garrison. He's a widower, 34 years of age, 2 children. The boy is 8, the girl just turned 6. He needs a housekeeper, not a nursemaid, though some assistance with the children is expected. Cooking, cleaning, household maintenance. You'd have your own room. Pay is $12 a month with board included. $12 a month. She had been making 9 in her last position, before everything had gone wrong. I'll take it, she said. Dobb looked at her over his spectacles again. You haven't asked about references or the conditions of the household. I'm sure I'll manage, Elsie said, and she smiled the particular smile she had developed for moments like this, composed, warm, just slightly distant. The smile of a woman who was fine and who intended to remain fine by the force of pure determination. Dobb wrote something in his ledger. Timothy Garrison will collect you at 9 tomorrow morning. He's a decent man, he added, almost as an afterthought, in a tone that suggested he did not always have occasion to say that about his clients. Elsie thanked him, found the modest boarding house 2 doors down, and spent the night staring at the water-stained ceiling of her room, listening to the sounds of the frontier town settling into its uneasy evening rhythms. Somewhere down the street, a piano played. Somewhere closer, a dog barked at something it feared. She understood that dog completely. She allowed herself to think, just for a moment, about what she was running from. Not the full shape of it. She could not afford to look at it directly, the way you could not afford to look at the sun, but the edges of it. A man named Harlan Pruitt, who had been her employer in Kansas City. A situation that had gone from uncomfortable to dangerous with a speed that still made her breath go short. A moment of desperate decision-making and a midnight departure that had taken her first to St. Louis, then to Abilene, and finally here, to Redstone Fork, where she was gambling that she had gone far enough that he would not follow. She pressed the thought down, flat and contained, the way she had learned to press dangerous things. Tomorrow was a new day. Tomorrow was a new name, not entirely new. She had kept her real name, because changing it had felt like a kind of death she was not willing to participate in, and a new position. And perhaps, if she was careful and worked hard and kept her distance, a genuine chance at something stable. She was asleep before she could think any more about it. Timothy Garrison arrived at 8:55 the next morning, which told her something about him immediately. He drove a solid buckboard wagon pulled by a bay horse, and he climbed down with the unhurried economy of movement that belonged to men who spent their days doing physical work, and had long since stopped performing effort for anyone's benefit. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair that needed cutting and a face that was weathered and serious, and she noticed with a carefulness she did not examine too closely, genuinely handsome in a way that had nothing to do with vanity and everything to do with structure. He took off his hat when he saw her. That told her something else about him. "Miss Carver," he said. "Mr. Garrison," she replied, and they shook hands with the formality of a business arrangement, which it was. He loaded her carpetbag into the wagon without being asked, and she climbed up without needing help, and they set off on the 6-mile drive to the ranch in a silence that was not hostile but was certainly careful. She appreciated that. She was not interested in men who felt the need to fill silence with the sound of their own voices. "Mr. Dobb told me you've done housekeeping work before," Timothy said, when they were clear of the town and moving through the wide, sun-blasted landscape of scrub oak and dusty grass that characterized this part of Texas. "Yes," she said. "I spent 2 years as a housekeeper for a family in Missouri. Before that, I worked in a hotel kitchen in St. Louis. I know how to run a house, and I know how to cook for people who work hard and need real food." He nodded. "My children," he said, and then paused as if he was selecting his words with the same care he might select timber. "They've had some difficulty. Since their mother passed, it's been 18 months. They're good children, but they've had some difficulty with consistency." 3 housekeepers in 18 months. Each one left for her own reasons. I'm telling you this because I want you to understand what you're coming into, not to put fear in you. She looked at him sideways. What reasons did they leave? Another pause. Mrs. Hodge found the isolation too much. Mrs. Perkins had a family situation that required her elsewhere. Miss Farrow, he stopped. Miss Farrow, Elsie prompted. Miss Farrow decided that the position was not what she had expected, Timothy said, and there was something careful about his voice now, something that closed off a corridor she had been about to walk down. She filed that away and did not push. I have no family elsewhere, she said, and I'm not troubled by isolation. I'll stay as long as the arrangement works for both parties. He glanced at her then, a quick, assessing look that she felt rather than saw. Dobbs said you came from Abilene. I did, she said. Before that, Missouri, she said, which was true, and left out Kansas City, which was the part that mattered and the part she was not discussing. He accepted this without pressing, and she was grateful, and they rode the rest of the way in that careful silence, and she spent the time looking at the land. The way it opened up as they moved northeast, the way the scrub gave way to taller grass, and then to the long shadow of the escarpment that rose in the distance, and the way a man's ranch, when it came into view, told you something essential about the man. The Garrison Ranch told her that it had once been very well kept and had been struggling for the last 18 months. The house was solid, well built, a proper 2-story timber-framed structure with a covered porch and real glass windows, which meant money and care had gone into it originally. But the porch railing needed repainting, and the kitchen garden was a tangle of neglect, and 2 of the porch steps had warped from rain. The barn was in better shape. The animals had not been neglected, but the domestic spaces had clearly suffered. A man taking care of the ranch and the cattle and the business of survival, she thought. And coming home to a house that was sliding slowly out of order, and 2 children inside it, doing the same. Henry met them at the porch steps with his arms crossed, and his expression the very picture of defensive hostility, which she recognized immediately for what it was, a child who had learned to protect himself from being abandoned by people who arrived, and then left. Clara stood behind him, peeking around his shoulder, and the hope in her face was so naked and so painful that Elsie felt it somewhere behind her sternum. Henry, Clara, Timothy said, setting the brake on the wagon. This is Miss Carver. She'll be keeping the house. Hello, Clara said, immediately and breathlessly. Henry said nothing. Elsie stepped down from the wagon and crouched slightly so she was closer to their level, which was something she had learned to do a long time ago, back when she had briefly thought she might be a teacher before life had redirected her. Hello, Henry, she said. And Clara, I'm very glad to meet you both. I've heard this is a fine ranch. Who told you that? Henry demanded. Your father, she said. Henry looked at his father. You said that. I might have said something along those lines, Timothy said, with a dryness that she suspected was humor, the well-guarded kind. Henry looked back at Elsie with those sharp, too-old eyes. The last one didn't stay, he said, flat. Factual, a test disguised as a statement. I know, Elsie said. I intend to stay, but I understand if you'd like to make up your own mind about that rather than take my word for it. Something shifted in Henry's expression. Not warmth, he was far too defended for that yet, but a crack, a recognition. She had not promised him anything she could not guarantee. She had simply told him the truth, and he was old enough to recognize the difference between the real thing and a comfortable lie. The kitchen is a mess, he said finally, which was apparently his version of a welcome. Then I'll start there, she said. She started there, and by the end of the first day, she had the kitchen clean. A pot of beef stew on the stove, 3 weeks of accumulated laundry sorted, and a very clear understanding of the structural challenges of the household. By the end of the first week, she had the kitchen garden cut back and replanted with the hardier fall crops. Turnips, late beans, winter squash, and the porch steps repaired with wood she'd found in the barn, having watched Timothy use the tools often enough to know where they lived. By the end of the second week, she had Clara reading to her in the evenings from a small collection of books she found in the parlor, and Henry occasionally sitting nearby pretending not to listen, but listening entirely. And somewhere in those 2 weeks, something had begun happening that she had explicitly instructed herself not to permit. Timothy Garrison came home every evening from whatever work the ranch demanded: mending fences, moving cattle, managing the timber cutting that went on in the higher elevations. And he sat down at the kitchen table to a real meal for the first time in months, and he ate with the quiet, profound gratitude of a man who had been running on coffee and hardship. And he talked to his children, really talked to them, in a way that told her he was a genuinely good father who had been so exhausted by the business of mere survival that he had not had the energy left for the connecting. Now, fed and with the house in order, he had that energy. She would hear him reading to Clara in the evenings. She would hear him patiently working through arithmetic problems with Henry. She would hear, sometimes, the laughter of children, which was the best sound she had ever heard in her life. And she would stand very still in the kitchen and listen to it and tell herself firmly that this was not her family and this was not her life, and she was here to do a job, and she had a secret that could burn this entire arrangement to the ground if it ever found its way here. But then, on the evening of the 14th day, Timothy Garrison came into the kitchen after the children were in bed, and he poured himself a cup of coffee from the pot she always kept warm, and he sat down at the table and he said, "You repaired the porch steps." "They were a hazard," she said, without turning from where she was washing the supper dishes. "I noticed the garden as well," he said, "and the window in Clara's room that wouldn't close properly." She turned around. "I found a peg that had worked loose. It wasn't difficult." He looked at her with an expression she could not fully read, something that was made of several feelings layered over each other. "The last 3 housekeepers," he said slowly, "none of them did anything like that. They maintained, they kept things from getting worse. You've been making things better." "That's what good housekeeping is," she said. "Maybe," he said, "or maybe it's something else." She turned back to her dishes. "It's just housekeeping, Mr. Garrison." "Timothy," he said. She paused. "We're not in a formal setting, Miss Carver. We're in a kitchen at 9 in the evening. I'd prefer Timothy." "Then I'd prefer Elsie," she said. And she could hear that she had surprised herself with that, and she thought he could probably hear it too. "Elsie," he said, as if he was testing the sound of it, and something about the way he said her name went through her like a warm current, and she did not permit herself to feel it, but she felt it anyway. That was the moment, she would understand later, when the trap began to close. Not a trap set by him. He was not a man of hidden motives or calculated cruelty. She had understood that within the first 3 days. It was a trap set by the simple, relentless, absolutely forbidden fact of connection, of 2 people who were both careful and both wounded, and both trying very hard to want nothing more than they had, finding themselves wanting more. She told herself it was gratitude. She told herself it was the warmth of the house and the pleasure of work well done and the uncomplicated joy of the children. She told herself all of these things with great firmness and conviction, and none of them were untrue, and none of them were the whole truth. The whole truth was arriving at the end of the 3rd week, the evening when Clara looked up from the book they were reading together, and said with the devastating directness of a 6-year-old, "Elsie, are you going to be our new mama?" The silence that followed was the loudest silence Elsie had ever inhabited. "Clara," Timothy said from across the room, his voice carrying a warning she felt but that Clara was too young and too hopeful to heed. "Papa says you're not like the others," Clara continued, entirely undaunted. "Papa says you're someone who would stay." And that was the moment. That was the moment when Elsie looked at Timothy across the warm parlor, and he looked back at her, and she saw in his face something he had not intended her to see, something he had apparently not intended anyone to see, which was that he meant it. That he had meant it when he said it to his children, privately, in what he had thought was a private moment, and that the hope in it was as naked and as painful as the hope that had been in Clara's face on that very first day. "I'm going to step outside for a moment," Elsie said carefully, and she set down her book and walked out the front door into the cool October night, and she stood on the repaired porch in the dark and breathed the clean, star-scattered air of the Texas night and had a very frank internal conversation with herself. The conversation went approximately as follows. She had a secret. The secret was this: in Kansas City, 9 months ago, she had worked as a housekeeper for a man named Harlan Pruitt, who was a businessman of the kind that the law sometimes looked at sideways and sometimes looked away from depending on the prevailing wind, and his current level of generosity to those who held positions of authority. Pruitt had decided, over the course of 6 months, that Elsie's role in his household should expand beyond housekeeping, and when Elsie had declined this expansion with increasing firmness, things had taken a darker turn. She had not been hurt. She wanted to be clear with herself about that. She had seen what was coming and she had left before it arrived. But in leaving, she had taken with her a letter. She had found it purely by accident, in a desk she had been cleaning, and its contents had been damning enough that she had taken it not out of malice, but out of the stunned certainty that she needed to have it in case Pruitt ever came after her. The letter documented a land deal of the thoroughly fraudulent variety, involving the displacement of several legitimate homesteading families and a judge who had been significantly encouraged to rule in Pruitt's favor. The letter was still in Elsie's carpetbag, wrapped in an oilcloth, tucked at the very bottom beneath her spare dress and her mother's Bible. She had not known what to do with it, and she had been afraid to send it anywhere because she did not know who was safe and who was in Pruitt's pocket. She had been afraid to throw it away because it felt like evidence of something that deserved to be answered for. So she had carried it with her through 4 cities and 3 months of flight, and now it was here, on Timothy Garrison's ranch, and it was the reason she was afraid. Because if Pruitt was looking for her, and she had no way of knowing whether he was, and if he found her, he would follow her here. And that would bring something dark and potentially dangerous into the lives of these 2 children and this man who had already survived enough difficulty to last a lifetime. She had told herself she would leave before it came to that. She had told herself she would stay 3 months, save enough money to move again, and go somewhere truly remote and difficult to trace. She had told herself that at the beginning of the week. And now it was the end of the 3rd week, and Timothy Garrison had told his children she was someone who would stay, and she was standing on his porch in the dark, absolutely unable to make herself believe the lie she needed to believe. The door opened behind her. She knew it was him by the sound of his step. She had learned with an involuntary precision that she found alarming, the distinct sound of Timothy Garrison's boots on the boards of his own house. He stood beside her at the porch rail, and he was quiet for a moment, and the stars were extraordinary overhead, the great white river of them that poured across the Texas sky on clear nights, and somewhere in the distance a coyote called and another answered. "I shouldn't have said that to them," Timothy said finally. "It wasn't fair to put that on you." "Why did you say it?" she asked, because she needed to know, because not knowing was worse. He was quiet for a long moment. He put his hands on the porch rail and she could feel the deliberateness in him, the way he chose his words, the way he chose his timbre. "Because it was true," he said. "Because when I watch you with my children, I see someone who is not just doing a job. I see someone who looks at them and actually sees them. And I've been trying to give them everything I can, but I've been so short on time and energy that I know I've been falling short. And then you arrived and you just—" He stopped. "Just what?" she said softly. "You made it feel like a home again," he said, and the simplicity of it, the unguarded honesty of it, was more devastating than any elaborate declaration could have been. She gripped the porch rail. "Timothy," she said carefully, "there are things about me that you don't know." "There are things about me you don't know," he said. "This is different. Is it?" He turned to look at her, and in the starlight his face was serious and open, and she thought that he was quite possibly the most genuinely decent man she had ever encountered. "Elsie, I'm not asking you for anything you're not ready to give. I said what I said to my children because it was the truth of what I feel, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise. But I'm also not going to push you somewhere you don't want to go. I needed you to know. She looked at him for a long moment, and in that moment she made a decision that she knew was probably reckless and definitely dangerous and absolutely, completely right. I have a secret, she said. It's nothing dishonest about who I am. But there's a situation from my past that I haven't resolved, and it could potentially cause trouble if it finds its way here. I need you to know that before anything else. He held her gaze steadily. How much trouble? I don't know, she said honestly. Maybe none. Maybe I'm already far enough away, but maybe not, and I need you to understand that before you say things to your children that might not tell me, he said simply. So she told him. Standing on the repaired porch in the Texas starlight, she told him about Harlan Pruitt in Kansas City, about the letter in her carpetbag and the land fraud and the corrupt judge, about the midnight departure and the 3 months of moving from city to city, about the fear that had driven her to the end of the line in Redstone Fork. She told him all of it, and he listened without interrupting, and his expression moved through several things: concern, anger on her behalf, something that looked very much like the determination of a man who has just been given a problem he intends to solve. When she finished, the night was very still. You have the letter, he said. Yes. In your carpetbag. Yes. He was quiet for a moment, thinking. There's a circuit judge who comes through Redstone Fork in November, Judge Hale. I've known him for 6 years, and he is not the kind of man who can be bought. If that letter documents what you say it does, it needs to be in the hands of someone who can act on it. The longer you carry it alone, the longer Pruitt has the advantage of uncertainty. She stared at him. You're not telling me to leave. Why would I tell you to leave, he said, and there was something almost fierce in it. Because I've brought a potential danger into your home, into the home where your children, Elsie. He turned fully toward her, and his voice was level and absolutely certain. You have done nothing wrong. A man threatened you and you ran because you were smart enough to recognize the threat. You took evidence of a crime because it was the right thing to do, even if you didn't know what to do with it yet. And you've been carrying all of this alone for months, and you're still here, and you're still, he shook his head. You're still planting the kitchen garden and fixing the window in my daughter's room and teaching my son that honesty is better than comfortable promises. She felt the thing behind her sternum again, bigger this time, harder to dismiss. Don't make me into something I'm not, she said, and her voice was not entirely steady. I'm not making you into anything, he said. I'm just telling you what I see. Yes. They stood there for another long, quiet moment, and the coyote called again, and the stars burned overhead, and Elsie Carver felt, for the first time in a very long time, the specific and terrifying sensation of being fully seen by another person, and finding that they were not running in the other direction. I'm not sure what to do with this, she said finally, meaning all of it, the letter, the feelings, the impossible arithmetic of wanting something she had convinced herself she did not deserve. Neither am I, Timothy said, but I think we ought to figure it out together if you're willing. She looked at him. I'm willing, she said. They did not embrace. They did not speak again immediately. They stood on the porch for a while longer, in a silence that was different now, warmer, more inhabited, the silence of two people who have just decided to face the same direction. And then they went back inside, and the house held both of them. And in the morning the children came down to breakfast, and Elsie was there making buckwheat pancakes, and Timothy was there pouring coffee. And if both of them moved with a slightly different awareness of each other, the children were too focused on the pancakes to notice. The days that followed were not without complication. The world did not rearrange itself to accommodate the fact that Elsie Carver and Timothy Garrison had decided to face the same direction. Ranches ran on relentless, unglamorous labor, and November in Texas brought its own set of demands: early cold fronts, livestock to prepare for winter, timber contracts to fulfill before the ground froze. Timothy was often gone before first light and returned well after dark, and the house and children were Elsie's domain, and she ran it with the competence and warmth she had brought from the first day, but now with the additional weight of knowing that this was not just a job she was performing. This was her life, or it was becoming her life, and the knowledge of that was both wonderful and frightening. Henry was watching. He was always watching. He was a child who had learned that happiness was a provisional condition, something that could be revoked without warning, and he tracked Elsie's movements and expressions with a quiet vigilance that would have been heartbreaking if it had not also been, in its own way, a form of devotion. She began to find ways to pull him in. Not with grand gestures. Henry was too shrewd for grand gestures, but with small, practical things. She asked his opinion on the kitchen garden layout. She consulted him about which of the 3 horses in the barn was best tempered, and then actually listened to his answer and acted on it. She made a point of teaching him to make biscuits, which he resisted furiously, and then took to with an absorbed concentration that told her he found the precision of it satisfying. One afternoon, about 3 weeks after the night on the porch, she and Henry were in the kitchen making biscuits for supper when he said, without looking up from the dough, "Are you going to marry my father?" Elsie's hand stilled. "Where did that come from?" she asked carefully. "Clara thinks you are," Henry said. "She talks about it at night. She thinks you don't know." Elsie resumed working the dough. "What do you think?" she asked. Henry was quiet for a moment in that specific way of his that meant he was being very honest with himself before he was honest out loud. "I think I want you to," he said, "but I also know that Miss Farrow acted like she was going to stay too." Elsie set down the biscuit cutter. She turned to face him fully, giving him the directness he deserved. "What happened with Miss Farrow?" she asked. She had never pushed on this, but Henry was bringing it himself, and that meant he needed to talk about it. Henry pressed his lips together. "She said she loved us," he said. "She said it a lot. She told Papa she wanted to be part of the family. And then one day she was just gone, and Papa wouldn't tell us why." Elsie could piece together the outline of this story without being told. A woman who had set her cap at a recently widowed rancher, who had made large declarations to children she used as leverage, who had been gently, or perhaps not so gently turned away when it became clear that Timothy Garrison was not yet ready for what she was offering, or not ready to offer it in return. The children were the casualties of that miscalculation. "Henry," she said, "I have not told you that I love you. I'm telling you now plainly that I do. And I'm also telling you that whatever happens between your father and me is between your father and me, and neither of us will make you promises we aren't certain we can keep. Does that make sense?" He thought about it with that serious, careful face. "Yes," he said. "Good," she said. "Now you've overworked that dough and the biscuits are going to be a bit tough, which is a lesson we're both going to have to learn from." He looked down at the dough and then up at her with an expression that was, for the first time without reservation, the expression of a child who was beginning to allow himself to trust. "I think they'll still taste good," he said. "They will," she agreed. "'Cause I have them on the highest authority that everything made in this kitchen is excellent." "Who told you that?" "You did," she said. "Last Tuesday, you asked for seconds and then thirds." He almost smiled. It was the almost that she treasured because the almost was real, and real was what she was building here, one unbothered afternoon at a time. The circuit judge, Nathaniel Hale, arrived in Redstone Fork on a Thursday in mid-November, and Timothy brought Elsie to town with him to present the letter. This was not a comfortable journey. Elsie sat beside Timothy on the buckboard wagon in the cold morning air, with the oilcloth packet in her lap, and she was aware that she was about to do something irrevocable, put evidence of a powerful man's crime into the hands of someone who might act on it, which would make her an active participant in a legal proceeding, and would make her impossible to miss if Prude had been searching for her quietly. "You don't have to do this today," Timothy said, reading her in that way he had developed over the weeks, the way of a man who paid attention to the person beside him. "I do," she said. "I've been carrying it long enough." The families who lost their land, they deserve better than me carrying around the proof of it and never doing anything." He looked at her with something warm and certain in his eyes. "All right then," he said, and he put the horse into a steady trot, and she held the packet on her lap with both hands and kept her spine straight. Judge Hale was a compact, sharp-eyed man of 60 who listened to Elsie's account with a stillness that she found either impressive or terrifying, and then read the letter twice, and then asked 3 specific questions about the date on it, and the form of the signature, and the name of the second party mentioned in it. He asked about her own circumstances with a forthright bluntness that she met with equal directness. He did not appear to judge her for the running. He appeared, if anything, to consider it sensible. "This is actionable," he said, when he had finished his questions. "Harlan Pruitt is a name that has come up in certain contexts before, but documentation has been difficult to obtain. You are the first person to bring me something concrete." He paused. "You understand that your name will be part of a deposition?" "Yes," she said. "And you understand that Pruitt will know who provided the evidence?" "Yes," she said again. "Are you in a position of safety currently?" Timothy, who had sat silent throughout this exchange, said, "She is." Hale looked at him and then at Elsie, and she saw him assess the situation with the efficiency of a man who had spent decades evaluating the truth behind what people presented him with. Whatever he saw, he nodded. "Very well," he said. "I will begin the process. It will not be immediate. I need to convene with the federal court in Austin, and there are procedural steps. But I want you to know that what you've done today is not a small thing, Miss Carver. What you've carried in that bag has been eating at you, and you brought it to the right place." She walked out of that office into the cold November air and felt something unknot in her chest that she had not fully realized was knotted. Timothy was beside her, and he did not say anything immediately, but his hand found hers as they walked toward the wagon, and she let it, and the warmth of it went all the way through her. "It's done," she said, slightly wonderingly. "Most of it," he said. "There may still be some difficulty before it's fully resolved. Pruitt may hear about the deposition before the legal process protects you." "I know," she said, "but it's better. It was always going to be better to act than to hide." He squeezed her hand. "Yes," he said, "it was." They drove back to the ranch in a different kind of quiet, not the careful quiet of the beginning, not even the warmer quiet of the porch night, but the quiet of 2 people who have just done a hard thing together and are resting in the shared aftermath of it. That evening, after the children were in bed, Timothy sat at the kitchen table long after supper, and Elsie sat across from him with a cup of tea, and neither of them spoke for a while, and then he said, "I want to tell you about Sarah." Sarah was his wife. He had not spoken of her directly to Elsie before. The children mentioned her sometimes, Clara with the somewhat abstract grief of a child who had lost her mother at 4 and was working from fragments of memory, Henry with the precise and guarded grief of a boy who remembered enough to make the loss sharp. Elsie set down her cup and listened. He told it simply, the way he did everything. Sarah had grown up in Redstone Fork, the daughter of the blacksmith. They had married young. He was 22, she was 20, and built the ranch together from almost nothing. And it had been a real partnership, the kind built from genuine affection and shared stubbornness in equal measure. She had been sick for 8 months before she died, and the last 4 of those months she had known she was dying, and they had talked, he said this quietly, they had talked about what he should do. She had been very direct about it, Sarah. She had told him that she did not want him to turn their house into a shrine and their children into keepers of her memory. She had told him he was too young to be lonely and too good to be wasted on grief. "She sounds remarkable," Elsie said. She was practical, he said, which Elsie understood was his highest compliment. She loved us in the most practical way, which means she thought about what we needed, not what she needed. Even when she was dying, she was thinking about what we needed. Elsie was quiet for a moment. "Is that why you told the children I was someone who would stay?" she asked, not accusatorially, genuinely. He looked at her. "I told them that because I believe it," he said. Not because I was trying to make you into anything, and not because I was trying to replace anything. I told them that because in the 6 years since Sarah died, wait, I mean the 18 months since Sarah died, he stopped, shook his head slightly. 18 months. It has felt much longer. In the 18 months since she died, I have watched my children get careful, the way Henry got careful. The way Clara tries so hard to be good enough to make people stay. And then you came, and within 2 weeks you had Henry making biscuits and Clara reading out loud, and you fixed the window in her room and replanted the kitchen garden, and you were honest with my son when he tested you, and you brought that letter to the judge today without hesitating even though it scared you, and I looked at all of that and I thought, he paused, and his voice was very level and very deliberate, the way it was when he was saying something real. I thought, that is the kind of person who stays. Elsie pressed her hands flat on the table to keep them still. I'm not Sarah, she said. I know, he said. I'm not asking you to be. I have sharp edges, she said. I've been running for a long time and I have habits from that suspicion, self-reliance to a degree that might be difficult to live with. I'm not always warm. I'm good at the work and I love your children and she stopped herself. You what? He said softly. She looked at him across the table in the kitchen light with the last of the supper things put away and the house quiet around them. I think you may be the best man I have ever met, she said, and then she felt her face warm because she had not meant to say it quite that plainly. He held her gaze and the something in his expression settled into a certainty that she felt in her bones. Then let's not make it more complicated than it needs to be, he said. She laughed, suddenly and genuinely, because of course he would say something like that. You make everything sound so straightforward, she said. Most things are, he said. People dress them up in complications because they're afraid of the straightforward answer. I'm afraid, she said honestly. So am I, he said. That doesn't mean the answer isn't straightforward. The kiss, when it came, was not dramatic. It was simply him leaning across the kitchen table and her meeting him halfway. And it was warm and quiet and entirely certain, and it tasted like the coffee they had both been drinking and felt like the moment when a cold house finally gets a fire going in it. Clara, who had padded downstairs for a glass of water, saw them and then padded immediately back upstairs without the water, and they heard, very distinctly through the ceiling, the sound of a 6-year-old bouncing on her bed with a barely suppressed squeal of joy. Timothy pulled back and looked up at the ceiling with an expression of profound parental resignation. We are never going to hear the end of this, he said. No, Elsie agreed, laughing softly. We are not. The weeks that followed were the warmest weeks of Elsie Carver's adult life, which was not to say they were without difficulty, because the world did not arrange itself around warmth. November rolled hard into December, and the first blue norther came howling down from the panhandle with the specific cruelty of a Texas winter, making its intentions plain: temperatures that dropped 50 degrees in 6 hours, ice that coated the fence lines, cattle that needed moving to lower ground before the cold took them. Timothy and his 2 ranch hands, a quiet Mexican man named Rodrigo, and a young Comanche man named Abel who had worked for the Garrison ranch since before Sarah died, were out in it for 3 days straight, sleeping in the barn at intervals to make sure the livestock survived. Elsie kept the house, kept the fire, kept the children warm and fed, and went out to the barn herself twice daily with hot food and coffee in a covered pot, walking through the ice with her coat pulled tight and her breath a white plume ahead of her. You don't have to do this, Rodrigo told her the first time, not unkindly. Someone does, she said practically, and handed him a bowl of chili and cornbread, and he looked at her with the considering respect of a man who was revising his assessment of someone upward. Abel, who was perhaps 22 and almost entirely silent, looked at her with calm dark eyes and accepted his food with a gravity that she returned in kind. She learned, over those cold days, that Abel had worked for the Garrison Ranch, because Timothy was one of the few ranchers in this part of Texas who paid all his workers the same rate regardless of their origins. which was not the standard practice in 1883 and was actively considered eccentric by some of his neighbors. Rodrigo had been with him 7 years, Abel 3. Both of them were loyal with the particular loyalty of men who had been treated fairly in a world that did not always offer fairness, and who had filed that fact away in the place where they kept the things that actually mattered. This told Elsie something important about Timothy Garrison that she had suspected but not confirmed, which was that his decency was not a surface arrangement. It was structural. It was in the bones of the man. When the norther passed and Timothy came back to the house and stood in the kitchen doorway looking like the weather had done its best work on him, red-cheeked and ice-bearded and visibly exhausted, and Clara ran into him at full speed and Henry said, "We kept everything running, Papa." With the fierce pride of a boy who had been genuinely useful, Elsie handed Timothy a cup of coffee and met his eyes, and they shared, for a moment, the particular wordless communication of two people who have been holding the same thing from different sides and are glad to see each other. "You went out to the barn," he said. "Of course," she said. "Rodrigo told me," he said. "He said you went twice a day and that the chili was very good." "The chili was exceptional," she said. He smiled a full smile, which she had learned was rarer and therefore more valuable than the careful almost smiles and the dry humor, and it changed his face entirely, and she thought, not for the first time, that she was in real and thorough trouble, the best kind. Christmas came to the Garrison Ranch with a quiet festivity that Elsie had not experienced since childhood. She made a tree from a small cedar she and Henry cut together from the edge of the creek, and they decorated it with strings of dried cranberries and small cloth figures she sewed from scraps, and on Christmas morning the children found small presents under it: a new hair ribbon for Clara, a pocket knife for Henry, practical and real and chosen with care. Timothy gave Elsie a length of deep green wool fabric, enough for a winter dress. She had told him once in passing that she preferred green to every other color. He had remembered. She held the fabric in her hands and looked at it and then at him, and she understood that she had stopped telling herself any of the old stories. The ones about not deserving this, about the danger, about the distance she was supposed to keep. She had stopped because they were no longer true, and she was a person who tried to live in accordance with the truth. She made him a pair of gloves from the same leather she had used for a repair job on the harness, stitched fine and close and lined with wool. He put them on and flexed his fingers and said, "These are the best gloves I've ever owned." And she believed him because he was not a man who said things he did not mean. In January, word came from Redstone Fork via the telegraph that a federal warrant had been issued for Harlan Pruitt's arrest in Kansas City, the result of Judge Hale's proceeding moving forward more rapidly than anticipated. A letter from Hale's office arrived the following week, informing Elsie that her deposition had been entered into evidence, that Pruitt had been apprehended, and that the families whose land had been fraudulently seized were in the process of having their claims reviewed. She would not be required to appear in person, given the completeness of the documentary evidence, unless the matter went to a full trial, in which case she would be notified. She read the letter at the kitchen table on a Tuesday morning with the winter sun coming through the clean windows she had washed herself, and something inside her, some last held-back portion of herself, released. She was free. She was genuinely and completely free. She sat with this for a moment, letting it settle. Then she folded the letter carefully, put it in her apron pocket, went to the barn, and told Timothy, who read it standing in the winter light of the barn door with his expression doing the exact opposite of its usual containment. She could see every feeling in him, relief and satisfaction and a particular bright fierceness that she had begun to understand was his version of joy. "It's over," he said. "Yes," she said. He folded the letter and gave it back to her, and then he did something he had not done yet in the daylight in the open, where Rodrigo was just visible in the far end of the barn. He pulled her in and held her, firmly and completely, and she pressed her face against his shoulder and breathed in the smell of him, wood smoke, hay, cold air, the honest, clean smell of hard work, and let herself be held for the first time in a very long time. "I need to ask you something," he said, his voice low against her hair. "Ask," she said. "I'd like you to marry me," he said, with no preamble whatsoever, which was so profoundly characteristic of him that she felt the tears come before she had consciously decided to cry. "Not because of the children, though they would be glad. Not because of the house. Because I want you. Specifically and entirely you, with your sharp edges and your kitchen garden and your habit of fixing things nobody asked you to fix and your green eyes and the way you told my son the truth even when it was hard and everything else you are. I want all of it." She was crying, which she was somewhat annoyed about, though not very. "Yes," she said. "That is my answer. Yes." He pulled back just enough to look at her face, and his expression in that moment was the most unguarded she had ever seen it, stripped of all the careful weathered composure and showing the man underneath it, which was a man who had been lonely and was not anymore, and who was aware of the significance of that and was not trying to pretend otherwise. "Yes," she said again, because it needed saying twice. They were married in March of 1884, in the small white church in Redstone Fork, which was filled somewhat to overflowing, because Timothy Garrison had been part of this community for a long time, and the community had opinions about his happiness, most of which were favorable. Judge Hale, who happened to be in town again on circuit, sat in the third pew and nodded at Elsie with the solemn approval of a man who felt that the universe had managed, on this occasion, to arrange itself correctly. Rodrigo and Abel were both there, Rodrigo in a new vest, and Abel in a ribbon shirt that Elsie would later learn he had made himself, and they sat near the back with the quiet dignity of men who were not accustomed to being explicitly included in things but were clear about why they had come. Clara was the flower girl, a role she had been practicing for approximately 6 weeks, and that she performed with a trembling, enormous seriousness that made several members of the congregation cry. Henry stood next to his father as a witness, wearing his best Sunday clothes and an expression of such complex emotion, pride, joy, relief, and the particular fierce protectiveness of a boy who had decided to allow himself to want this, that Elsie had to look at him quickly and then look away before she completely lost her composure. The ceremony was plain and honest and beautiful. When Timothy took her hands and said, "I do," he said it looking at her directly with those steady dark eyes, and it was, she thought, the most certain thing she had ever heard. When she said, "I do," she meant it with every part of herself, including the parts that had been broken and the parts that had been afraid and the parts that had spent 3 years running and had finally, completely, stopped. Afterward, back at the ranch, Rodrigo produced a guitar that nobody had known he possessed, and Abel turned out to have a completely unexpected talent for the fiddle, and there was dancing in the yard despite the March chill, and Clara danced with her father and then with Henry and then with Rodrigo in a spinning, laughing pattern that went until she was dizzy, and Henry, red-eared but genuinely pleased, danced one careful and correct dance with Elsie that they had practiced exactly once in the kitchen 2 days prior, and she thanked him very seriously afterward, and he said, with the gravity of a lord, "I think you made a good choice," meaning his father, and she almost choked on her. Laughter. Spring arrived and then summer, and the Garrison ranch ran and breathed and grew. The kitchen garden expanded under Elsie's management to something genuinely ambitious, not just the practical winter crops but tomatoes and beans and sweet corn, and a small plot of sunflowers that Clara adopted as personally hers. The house was repainted, which Timothy and Rodrigo did together over 2 long weekends in April. The fence lines were mended, and the timber contracts renewed, and the cattle were running well. Elsie fell into the rhythms of the ranch, the way she had always fallen into the rhythms of hard work, completely and without complaint. But now the work was hers, genuinely hers, not a job performed for someone else's household but the daily making of her own life. She was Timothy's partner in the most real sense, keeping the books and managing the household accounts with a precision that freed him from the mental weight of it, and consulting with him on decisions with the ease of two people who had learned each other's thinking and found it compatible. They fought occasionally, because they were both strong-willed and neither of them had any practice at yielding, and the first real argument about whether to take on a second timber contract that Elsie thought was overextension, and Timothy thought was necessary growth, lasted 2 days and produced more frost in the household than the January norther had. Clara walked around them on both days with an anxious face until Henry told her, with an authority that suggested he had thought about this considerably, "They're just thinking out loud at each other. It's fine," and Clara considered this and decided to believe him. They resolved it the third morning over coffee, with the pragmatic directness that was their natural language. Timothy acknowledged that her concerns about cash flow were valid. Elsie acknowledged that his reading of the market conditions was probably right, and they arrived at a compromise that turned out to be smarter than either of their original positions, which was the way of it when two practical people disagreed honestly. That evening, when the children were asleep, Timothy said, "You were mostly right." "You were mostly right," she said. "Mostly is not the same as entirely." "No," he agreed, and his mouth curved, and they were all right and had always been all right, because they were people who fought about real things and resolved them instead of letting them fester, and both of them had been through enough darkness to know the value of not wasting time on pretended wounds. In August, on a morning when the heat was absolute and the dry grass was gold as far as the eye could see, Elsie realized she was pregnant. She sat with this knowledge for one quiet morning, out in the kitchen garden in the early cool, letting it settle into her the way the certainty of spring settling into ground does, slow and complete and entirely real. Then she told Timothy, that evening in the kitchen, simply and directly. He went very still, the way he went still when something was important enough to require all his attention, and then he set down his coffee cup and stood up from the table and crossed to her in 2 steps and held her face in his large, careful hands and looked at her with an expression she would keep for the rest of her life, bright and serious and full of something that was too big for any single word to contain. "Are you well?" he asked, which was the first thing he asked, and it was exactly the right first thing. "I'm very well," she said. "I feel completely well." "Good," he said, and his voice was slightly unsteady, which she found she liked very much. "That's good." "Yes," she agreed. "It is." He kissed her, and it was the kind of kiss that said things neither of them would have chosen to say out loud, and she put her hands over his where they held her face, and they stood in the kitchen light and the heat of August and the warmth of a life that was building itself around them, solid and real and theirs. Henry, when told, handled it with extreme dignity for exactly 4 minutes before he said, "Will it be a boy?" with a hope he was clearly trying to seem indifferent to. "We won't know until it arrives," Elsie said. "But if it's a boy, perhaps you could teach him what you know about biscuits." Henry considered this with the gravity it deserved. "I've gotten quite good," he said. "You have," she agreed. Clara, when told, immediately began compiling a list of names and also demanded to know if she could share her room, and when Elsie said she was more than welcome to eventually if she would like, Clara spent the rest of the evening sitting with Elsie and asking extremely detailed questions about what babies were like, most of which Elsie answered truthfully, and some of which made her laugh so hard she had to press her apron to her face. The pregnancy was not difficult, but neither was it entirely uncomplicated. She was ill in the mornings throughout October and November, which she managed with the same methodical refusal to be defeated that she brought to everything, maintaining the household and the cooking and the accounts even on the worst mornings, though Timothy had instituted a firm rule that she was to sit down at intervals throughout the day, which she found irritating and followed roughly 60% of the time, which he counted as a significant victory, given what he knew of her character. "You are the most stubborn woman on the surface of this earth," he told her one evening in November, after catching her carrying a load of firewood that she had been explicitly not supposed to carry. "I carried much heavier things when I was perfectly fine," she said. "You are perfectly fine," he said, taking the firewood, "and I intend to keep it that way, which means you need to stop carrying wood." She looked at him with her most composed expression. "You're being unreasonable." "I am being sensible," he said. "There is a meaningful difference." "That sounds like something I said to you once," she said. "I learned from the best," he said, and the humor was so dry that it took her a moment to catch it, and then she laughed, and he felt, the way he always felt when he made her laugh, that he was a very rich man. The baby came on a Tuesday in late February of 1885, during a spell of mild weather that felt like an early promise of spring. The birth was attended by Mrs. Adeline Porter, Redstone Fork's most experienced midwife, a woman of great competence and zero sentimentality, who managed the entire process with the efficiency of a military operation and the warmth of a genuine human being who had been present at a great many arrivals. It was a boy. He came into the world loudly and immediately, which Mrs. Porter said was a very good sign, and he was healthy and solid and possessed from the first moment of a stubborn expression that made Timothy look at him, and then at Elsie and say, with profound recognition, "He's yours all right." "He has your eyes," Elsie said, exhausted and entirely triumphant. "He has your chin," Timothy said. "God help us all." They named him James William Garrison James for no particular reason except that it was right, and William for Timothy's father, who had homesteaded the original land this ranch was built on, and who had died the year before Henry was born, leaving Timothy with the land and the timber, and the responsibility of growing something worthy of it. Henry met James William with the expression of a young man who has received a gift he had pretended not to want, and is discovering that it is actually exactly what he wanted. He held him in the kitchen the morning after the birth, stiffly at first and then with increasing confidence, and Clara crouched beside the chair and watched her new brother with her whole face, and Timothy stood in the doorway of the kitchen and looked at his family, all four of them in that warm morning light, and felt something settle in him that had been unsettled for a very long time. The rest of 1885 was the richest year the Garrison Ranch had ever seen, financially and otherwise. The second timber contract, their compromise arrangement, paid out well. The cattle herd was up 30% on the previous year. Rodrigo got married to a woman named Petra from the town, and the whole Garrison household attended the wedding with genuine joy. Abel, who had gradually become something between an employee and a close friend of the household, began teaching Henry to ride properly, not just to sit a horse but to work one, and Henry took to it with the focused passion of a boy who had found his calling. Elsie, running the house and accounts with one arm and managing a baby with the other, was happier than she had words for. She wrote letters to Judge Hale's office once to learn that Pruitt had been convicted of fraud and sentenced to prison in Kansas City, and that 2 of the 3 homesteading families had had their land claims restored. She sat with that letter for a long time, thinking about the cold night she had spent alone in a boarding house in Redstone Fork with $4.30, and a secret that felt like a stone tied around her neck. She thought about the porch steps she had repaired because they were a hazard. She thought about the kitchen garden, about biscuits, about a 6-year-old who had said, "Are you going to be our new mama?" with her whole face open and hopeful. She went and found Timothy in the barn, where he was mending a piece of harness, and she told him about the letter, and he listened, and then she said, "I want you to know that everything I am is because I chose it. Not because I was desperate and had nowhere else to go. I mean I was desperate, and I did arrive here desperate, but all the choices I made after that were real choices. This life," she gestured with the letter, encompassing everything, the barn and the house and the ranch, and beyond it the children and James William sleeping in his crib, "is not a refuge. It's not me hiding in something that would have me. It's what I chose." Timothy set down the harness piece and looked at her. "I know," he said. "Do you?" she said. "You have never done a single thing that wasn't a choice," he said. "I knew that by the end of the first week. It's one of the reasons," he paused in his deliberate way. "It's one of the reasons I said what I said to the children." She pressed the letter flat against her palm. "That I was someone who would stay." "Yes," he said. She looked at him in the barn light. This man who had taken her in without knowing her fully and had then, when she had given him the full weight of her truth, chosen not to run in the other direction. This man who paid his workers fairly and got up before dawn every day and made time for his children even when he was exhausted and had learned, across 18 months of marriage, exactly how she took her coffee and exactly which topics she needed to talk through and exactly when to leave her alone with a problem and when to sit down beside her. "I'm going to stay," she said, which was both the simplest and the most important thing she had ever said. "I know," he said again, and he smiled that full, rare smile, and she went to him. And the barn was warm with the smell of hay and horse and the companionable smell of the harness oil. And James Williams slept in his crib in the house. And Henry was somewhere on the back pasture learning to work a horse properly. And Clara was in the kitchen garden with her sunflowers. And the Texas sky arched high and blue and relentless overhead. In the spring of 1887, when James William was 2 years old and had developed both the stubbornness and the particular laugh that were clearly genetic inheritances, Elsie found herself pregnant again. This time she told Timothy at breakfast in front of the children, partly because there was no real reason for secrecy, and partly because the children's reactions were, she had found, always excellent. Clara shrieked with pure joy and immediately began her second list of names. Henry said, "I hope it's another boy," with no pretense of neutrality. James William, who was 2 and entirely focused on his biscuit, said, "Boy," in perfect solidarity with his brother, having no idea what he was agreeing to. Timothy looked at Elsie across the breakfast table with the same expression he had worn in the kitchen 2 years ago, when she had told him the first time, that bright, solemn, enormous expression. And then he said simply, "I'm glad," and that was enough, because it was true and they both knew it. The second child was a girl, born in October of 1887, and named Rose Margaret Garrison Rose because Elsie had always loved the word, and Margaret for Elsie's mother, who had been a good woman in a hard life, and who Elsie thought about sometimes, standing in the kitchen garden in the early morning with the smell of growing things around her, and felt the long, sustaining thread of connection that ran backward through women who had worked and loved and made things grow in difficult ground. Rose was, from the very beginning, nothing like her brother James William. Where he was loud and determined and threw himself at the world with physical confidence, Rose was observant and still, a baby who would lie in her cradle watching the light through the curtains with an attention that her father found slightly uncanny and her siblings found fascinating. Henry in particular was enchanted by her, this small, serious person who looked at him as though she were taking notes. Clara took her oldest sibling responsibilities with enormous gravity and some genuine competence, and by the time Rose was 6 months old, Clara could manage her nearly as well as Elsie could, which was something Elsie encouraged while making very sure Clara understood that this was her choice and her pleasure, not her duty. "You're not required to look after her," Elsie told Clara, when Clara was nearly 10 and Rose was fat and cheerful on a blanket in the kitchen. "I want to be sure you know that." Clara looked at her with the particular expression she had inherited from her father's serious, direct, a little amused. "I know that," she said. "I like looking after her. She's interesting." "She is," Elsie agreed. "Mama," Clara said, which she had been calling her for over 2 years now, beginning one day without announcement or ceremony, simply shifting from Elsie to Mama as though it had always been the word, and Elsie had felt it the first time like a hand placed gently over the place behind her sternum where all the hardest feelings lived. "Yes," Elsie said. "I'm glad you came," Clara said, with the directness of a child who had grown into a girl who was learning to say the truest things without hesitation. "I'm glad you stayed." Elsie looked at her for a long moment, this girl with her father's serious eyes and her mother Sarah's dark hair, and some qualities that were entirely her own, qualities that had grown up in the years since a housekeeper had arrived on a buckboard wagon and crouched down to be at her level. "I'm glad I stayed too," Elsie said. "More than you know." She would tell the story, when Rose and James William were old enough to understand it, and when Henry was grown and had already heard most of it but sat in the parlor listening anyway with that careful, attentive face that had never fully lost its edge of watchfulness, but had become, over the years, watchfulness in service of love rather than watchfulness in service of self-protection. She would tell them about arriving in Redstone Fork with $4.30, about the carpet bag and the letter in the oilcloth, about the buckboard wagon and the bay horse and the man who had taken off his hat when he saw her and loaded her bag without being asked, about the porch steps that needed repairing and the window in Clara's room and the kitchen garden. She would tell them about the night she had stood on the porch in the dark and heard Clara say she was someone who would stay, and how terrifying and wonderful that had been simultaneously. She would tell them about the judge and about the legal proceeding and about the justice that had eventually been served not by violence, not by the kind of desperate frontier reckoning that the dime novels like to describe, but by a woman who had carried evidence carefully for months, and then, when she was finally safe enough, had placed it in the right hands. She would tell them, because she thought it was important for children to know, that the world contained injustice, and that injustice had to be answered for, and that answering for it was not always dramatic and dangerous, but was sometimes simply a matter of courage and persistence, and waiting for the right moment. She would tell them that their father was the best man she had ever known, and she would say it in front of him, and he would sit in his chair with his careful composure completely absent and his real face showing, and the children would laugh at how red his ears got, and it would be the best sound in the world, all of them together in the house that had been built with care, and rebuilt with love, and filled with the noise and warmth of a family that had found each other. In the winter of 1889, Henry, now 14 and shooting up toward his father's height with the sudden alarming speed of a young man who has decided to grow, came in from the barn one evening and sat down at the kitchen table with the particular expression of someone who has been thinking hard about something for a long time. Elsie was making bread. She had learned over the years that bread making was a good activity for conversations because it occupied her hands and kept her from looking directly at the person speaking, which sometimes made it easier for them to speak. "Elsie," he said. "Henry," she said, "I've been thinking about something." "All right," she said, working the dough. "I want to call you Mama," he said, with a directness that was purely his father's. "Clara does, James does, Rose does, I didn't before because," he stopped. She set down the dough and turned to look at him because some conversations required looking. "Because your mother was your mother," she said, "and she was." "Yes," he said, "but I also think," he pressed his lips together in that way he had when he was being honest even though honesty was hard, "I think she would have liked you. I think she would have wanted this, for us, for Papa." Elsie looked at this boy who had been 8 years old and furiously defended when she had arrived, who had tested her with the flatness of a closed door, who had gradually, carefully, with the precision of someone who does not make decisions lightly, decided to open, who had grown into a serious, capable, good-hearted young man who would become, she was entirely certain, a serious, capable, good-hearted man. "I think so too," she said. "So," he said, "if it's all right." "It's more than all right," she said. "It's what I would want very much." He nodded with the composed dignity of someone who is feeling a great deal and intends to keep it contained, which was so precisely his father that she had to look away for a moment and collect herself. "Good," he said. "Now the bread is going to stick if you don't get back to it." She laughed, turning back to the counter. "Is that so?" "I've been watching you make bread for 6 years," he said with the faintest edge of humor, the dry kind he had inherited. "I know when it's about to go wrong." "I've been making bread for 30 years," she said. "It's not going to stick." It didn't stick. The bread came out perfectly, the way her bread always did, and they ate it at supper that night with beef stew and the last of the fall butter. And Timothy, who had heard none of the kitchen conversation, looked at his son and his wife across the table and felt the thing he always felt in this kitchen in the evening, the profound, grounded certainty of a man who is exactly where he belongs. Rose, who was 2 and could now express opinions with great vigor, demanded more bread. James William tried to put butter in his sister's hair, and was redirected with the firm patience that Elsie had in abundance. Clara, nearly 11 and already reading every book in the small but growing collection that Elsie had been building for years, was trying to continue reading at the table and being told she couldn't, and putting the book down with a martyred expression that fooled no one. Henry said, passing the bread, "Mama, can I go to Redstone Fork with Rodrigo on Saturday?" Which was the first time he had said it, and he said it without ceremony, just dropped it into the regular conversation the way you would drop any word you had always been using. And Elsie said, "Ask your father," without ceremony either, and Timothy said, "What's the reason?" And Henry told him, and they discussed it with the practical back and forth of a family where everyone had a voice. Nobody made a big deal of the word. It was just a word. It was just the truest word. Later that evening, when the house was quiet and the children were in bed and the fire in the parlor was burning low, Elsie sat beside Timothy on the settee with her head against his shoulder, and he had his arm around her, and neither of them was reading or speaking, just inhabiting the evening together in the companionable silence that was their natural resting state. "Henry called me Mama tonight," she said. His arm tightened around her. "At supper," she said. "He just did it. He'd been thinking about it, I think. He talked to me in the kitchen before." Timothy was quiet for a moment. "How are you?" he asked. She thought about it. "I'm very full," she said, which was the most accurate thing she could find. "Full of something good." "Yes," he said. He pressed his lips to the top of her head. "Me too." Outside, the winter night was vast and clear, and the stars over the Texas plain burned with the cold brightness of things that have been there a very long time and will be there long after the specific warmth of any particular evening. Inside, the fire settled, and the house breathed around them, solid and well-kept and alive with the evidence of the people who lived in it. The books on the shelf and the bread cooling on the counter, and the small muddy boots by the door, and the crayon drawing Rose had done that afternoon tacked to the parlor wall, and the sound of sleeping children in the rooms above. Elsie Carver had come to the Garrison ranch as a housekeeper. She had arrived with a carpetbag and a secret and $4.30, and the controlled desperation of a woman who had run out of running room and was trying, with everything she had, to make something real from what she had left. She had not planned to stay. She had planned to save money and move on and keep moving until she was somewhere that Harlan Pruitt's long arm could not reach. She had planned to keep her distance and her detachment, and the careful space she had built around herself over 3 years of learning that connection was a form of risk. What she had not planned for was porch steps that needed repairing, or a kitchen garden full of weeds that wanted planting, or a boy of 8 with his arms crossed and his whole body braced for another disappointment, or a girl of 6 who had looked at her from the first moment with hope so naked it hurt to see, or a man who, standing in the starlight on his own porch, had said plainly and without performance, "I think you are someone who would stay." She had stayed. She had stayed and built and repaired and planted and loved, with her whole practical, stubborn, careful, finally unguarded heart, and the love had been returned in kind, in full, steady, enormous measure, by 4 children who called her Mama and 1 man who was her anchor and her North Star and her home in the most complete sense of the word. She had stayed, and it was the truest, best, most irrevocable thing she had ever done. The fire settled in the hearth. Timothy turned his head and pressed another kiss to her hair, unhurried and certain. Elsie closed her eyes and felt the warmth of him and the warmth of the house and the warmth of the life she had chosen, solid and permanent and completely, entirely hers. Outside, a coyote called. Far off, another answered. And the Garrison Ranch held its people through the winter night, steady and whole, as it would hold them through every night that followed, for all the years they had ahead of them, which were many.